The Rebel Alliance is remembered for never letting a single Separatist through its doors, and yet a Confederacy general once walked in with his entire holdout army behind him. He kept his soldiers and he gave up something else that mattered far more. Nobody had to force it out of him, and what he handed over explains the rebellion better than any speech its founders ever gave. About 18 years before that, on the jungle world of Onderon, Republic officers ran a training camp that taught a young fighter named Saw Gerrera how to bring down Separatists. Another fighter learned beside him in that same camp, and his mother held a seat in the Separatist Senate. The rebellion's first soldiers picked up their trade in a place built to destroy the people they would later have to judge. Judging them turned out to be two separate jobs, and nobody in that camp was ever taught to tell the difference. Onderon sat under a king the Confederacy had put on the throne, and the Republic could not land an army there without turning a neutral world into a battlefield. Republic officers armed the locals instead. Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka Tano, and Captain Rex taught a small band of fighters to ambush droid patrols and vanish before return fire landed. Saw Gerrera was one of those students, and his sister Steela fell on Onderon before the Republic's own war ended. His instructors had written that lesson plan to break the Confederacy. Two of those students landed on opposite sides of the rebellion's oldest argument. Saw came out of that jungle believing a cause could be judged by the company it kept, and he spent the rest of his life sorting people that way. The other student had grown up inside the very cause Saw was being trained to fight. Republic instructors handed the two of them the same explosives and never worked out how the movement they were seeding would tell those men apart. One fight in that circle had come from the other side of the war entirely. Lux Bontari's mother, Mina Bontari, held a seat in the Separatist Senate on Raxus. She spent that seat pushing for peace talks at a moment when the people running both sides wanted the shooting to continue. An attack claimed her life soon afterward. The Confederacy blamed Republic commandos for it, and Lux came to hold Count Dooku responsible instead. He walked out of Separatist politics after that and into an Onderon rebellion the Republic was quietly paying for. Whatever his mother had been building on Raxus, none of it outlived her. The peace she pushed for went into the ground alongside her, and the fighting ran on another 2 years. Lux walked away from a movement that had produced one of the few people working to end the war, and she had not been enough. Men like Lux would split the rebellion's founders for the next 2 decades. He believed in the Confederacy the way his mother had, as a way out of a government that had stopped listening to worlds like his. Padme Amidala traveled in secret to Raxus in an earlier arc in the Clone Wars, and she found a working Senate there. Its delegates treated leaving the Republic as a lawful choice, made because the Republic had stopped answering them. They debated, they voted, and not one of them knew that the man steering the Republic's war was steering theirs as well. Ordinary people had voted for separatism and carried real complaints into it, which is why the label could not be waved away once the shooting stopped. If the Confederacy had been nothing but Dooku's puppet show, then a former Separatist would have been carrying an empty word around after the surrender. Many of them were carrying something heavier than that. They were carrying an argument about how the galaxy should be run, and Imperial rule kept handing them fresh reasons to go on making it. 14 years later, that argument had hardened into something a person could be accused of. In Andor, Saw Gerrera sorted through the other rebel groups by their politics and threw out Anto Krieger's people for being separatists, using the word the way a prosecutor uses a charge. Saw had never been a separatist himself. He was the opposite, a Republic-trained fighter whose whole education came from officers who wanted the Confederacy finished, and when he needed an insult, he reached for the vocabulary those officers had issued him. The Empire spent 20 years making sure that word never faded. Imperial troops in the Bad Batch arrested a former Separatist senator named Avi Singh on Raxus and marched him through the streets of his own capital. Imperial officers wanted Singh's public obedience, and they wanted the crowd to walk home, understanding what their old alignment now cost them. Raxus had been the Confederacy's capital, and its people chose that alignment through a Senate that met in the open. Imperial planners picked those particular streets for exactly that reason. A parade past the old chamber told every Raxan that the votes their parents cast were now a charge waiting to be read back. Anyone in that crowd who later considered resisting carried a file the garrison already held. Worlds at the far edge of the galaxy paid the same price. On New Plimto, the Nosorians had joined the Confederacy for reasons that had nothing to do with Dooku's speeches. The Republic refused them a Senate seat, the market for their main export dried up, and Confederacy recruiters promised to rebuild everything the Republic had ignored. In the Legends comic series Dark Times, a Nosorian veteran named Bomo Greenbark comes home to find his clan gone. The clone army took most of them, and the rest were sold into forced servitude. Bomo had put his wife Mesa and his daughter Reysa on the last transport out himself, and he stayed behind to hold a pass while they ran. Imperial forces stopped that transport before it reached the spaceport. Mesa died in the slave pits of Orvax 4, fighting the men who came to take Reysa, and Bomo reached those pits hours after his daughter had been sold onto a buyer off-world. He found the buyer's house eventually. He found it far too late. Palpatine had already answered part of the Separatist question himself, in a bunker on Mustafar. In Revenge of the Sith, the Separatist Council waits out the last hours of the war on a volcanic world, expecting their patron to reward them for it. Darth Vader walks into the room and strikes down every one of them. Newt Gunray and Wat Tambor fall inside a few minutes alongside the rest, and Gunray spends his last seconds pleading. Vader then sends the shutdown order, and the droid army still goes across the Confederacy's front lines. Palpatine had his own apprentice and the men who paid for the war and ran its factories, and it happened before a single rebel cell existed. Separatist senators on Raxus, planetary governors, field officers, and ordinary citizens all outlived the council, and they came out of it with nobody above them. The bunker left behind commanders without a government and worlds whose patrons had been struck down by the man who recruited them. Every argument that followed about admitting separatists was an argument about the pieces Vader left behind. The companies that had bankrolled the war came out of it differently. Their directors fell on Mustafar with the rest of the council, and their shipyards did not. Trade Federation berths, Techno-Union foundries, and banking clan credit passed into Imperial hands and went to work on Imperial hulls. A Nosorian had joined because his export market died, and he lost his family to a bondholder's auction. The yards that had built the droid fleets carried on turning out warships under a new flag. Imperial officials broke up those companies, kept the machinery running, and left the punishment to the people who had believed in the cause. The Empire built both halves of the rebellion's problem at the same time. Imperial forces crushed the holdouts early and went on punishing former separatist worlds for years afterward, which left an enormous population with excellent reasons to fight back. The same policy kept the word poisonous, so anyone carrying it arrived at the rebellion's door already suspect. The Empire produced the recruits and spoiled the recruiting in one motion. Rex walks straight into the sharpest version of that problem in Rebels. He and a small rebel team stumble onto Kalani, a separatist tactical droid who has been sitting on Agamar since the surrender. Kalani has waited 16 years to finish a battle that was interrupted, and Rex was built and trained for exactly one war. The two of them fight the Clone Wars in miniature with a handful of soldiers on an empty world. Then an Imperial force arrives and starts shooting at both of them. Kalani stops fighting and runs the numbers instead. A tactical droid built to weigh odds works back through the war he lost, and the answer he reaches is one no clone ever wanted put into words. The Confederacy had been built to lose from the start. Rex was made to fight droids. The machine across from him was built to fight clones, and neither fact means anything to the officers now hunting them together. What Kalani does with his droid army once that fight ends decides more about the Alliance's rules than anyone on Agamar understood. If you want to see more videos like this one, a quick subscribe means you will always be first to know. The Alliance had to hold every one of those grudges inside one movement. It needed Republic veterans who had buried friends lost to droid artillery, and worlds that had watched droid armies land in their fields. It held clone soldiers built for one war against the Confederacy, former Separatist senators and Nosorians whose families clone troopers had sold at auction. Every one of those people had a solid reason to distrust somebody else standing in the room. Rebel recruiters could not fix that by pointing everyone at a shared enemy. The Empire was not some foreign power that everybody could recognize as an outsider. Palpatine kept the Republic's capital, its Senate building, its shipyards, its officer corps, and its laws. He never knocked the Republic down from outside the walls, and he finished the job from inside it, wearing the Republic's own authority. Rebel leaders had a problem with the word restore long before any Separatists asked to join. Opposing the Empire is easy enough to explain on its own. Adding a promise to put the Republic back together means arguing that the old government was worth saving and worth the war to defend it. The moment a rebel senator makes that argument out loud, she's also argued that the Confederacy was wrong to leave. A sincere separatist looking at the Empire saw something else entirely. The Confederacy's core complaint had been that the Republic was owned by core world money, deaf to the Outer Rim, and past fixing. The Empire came out of that same Republic, built by that same Chancellor. To a separatist, it looked like the ending they had predicted, arriving right on schedule. For 2 decades, rebel senators had to oppose Palpatine without ever conceding that his enemies in the last war had been right about him first. The founders had to decide who could join. Carrying all of that, Lux Bonteri had settled his own case years earlier. He fought the Separatist-backed king on Onderon, took the planet's seat in the Republic Senate afterward, and gave the simplest answer on offer. A separatist who stopped being one had nothing left to argue about. One Confederacy operative did work beside Saw Gerrera, and neither of them wanted it. In the novel Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear, set in the Empire's first year, a rebuilt Separatist sleeper agent named Sujan Vaknahalis wakes into a galaxy his side has already lost. He was left in storage in case the Confederacy lost, and losing is exactly what happened. Nobody recruits him, and nobody offers a place. Saw finds him while raiding a pirate ship for Separatist armaments and puts him to work, because Sujan is useful for a job Saw already wanted done. Neither man pretends this is friendship, and Saw has little patience for Separatists as a category. Sujan has no interest in joining a rebellion of any kind. He wants revenge for the Confederacy's defeat, and his aim narrows eventually to Palpatine alone, which is not the same goal as putting anything back together. Saw took the Separatist asset and refused the Separatist. The record holds no general amnesty anywhere in those years, and the founders spent the next 2 decades arguing over whether it should. The argument that followed had 3 names attached to it, and 3 different reasons. The same novel follows Mon Mothma through the Empire's first year, building a coalition out of senators from every corner of the old chamber. Some of them had sat with the Confederacy, and had gone on sitting in the Imperial Senate afterwards, with that record following them into every room. Even in that first year, with the war fresh and the council barely cold, the door was never fully shut. Mon Mothma had a practical reason for leaving it open. Every senator she approached was already being watched, and the ones with Separatist records were watched hardest of all. A former Confederacy delegate knew which Outer Rim worlds the Empire was stripping and which governors were doing the stripping. Refusing that on principle would have cost her the only clear view she had into half the galaxy. Taking it meant the movement she was assembling already held a people the Empire could name. An Imperial propagandist would eventually say exactly that. The same question takes a formal shape in the Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, which records where each founder stood and leaves the private reasoning to their careers. Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Garam Bel Iblis had almost nothing in common except a conviction that the New Order had to go, and the groups gathering around them had even less. Some of those groups wanted the Republic restored, others wanted no outside government of any kind ruling their sector, and a few had turned up looking for profit. Former Separatists opened a clear split between the 3 leaders in the movement's early years. Nobody in that room came from the worlds under discussion. Bel Iblis held a Corellian seat, Organa an Alderaanian one, and Mothma spoke for Chandrila. All 3 of those planets sat comfortably inside the core that the Confederacy had walked out over. 3 core world senators now decided which Rim worlds had grieved correctly enough to be let in, and a Separatist watching from outside would have recognized the arrangement at once. The chamber had changed its name and kept its address. Garam Bel Iblis argued for the widest door of the 3. He was a senator from Corellia with a long habit of defending a region's right to run its own affairs, and he wanted the line drawn at war crimes and nowhere else. Anyone who would serve the Confederacy with clean hands could serve the Alliance, and his argument had teeth, because the Alliance was already sheltering groups fighting for their own sector's independence, the very goal called separatism a few years earlier. By its own daily practice, the Alliance was not drawing a line of principle at all. Bel Iblis was also describing himself. He had spent a Senate career arguing that Corellia knew its own business better than Coruscant did, which is the Confederacy's complaint with the volume turned down. Judging what people believe would have put the senator making the argument inside his own net. Bel Iblis had a living example he could point at. Cham Syndulla spent the Clone Wars fighting a separatist occupation of Ryloth, and he spent the years afterwards fighting Imperial governors for the same reason. He wanted Ryloth free of outsiders, and he wanted nothing else at all. Rebel cells flew missions alongside him in Rebels, and he never once folded his fighters into anybody's chain of command. A man who had shot at droids for 3 years still would not sign what Ambigene signed. Bail Organa wanted a different test, and his was the hardest to satisfy. Every member had to accept that the rebellion's first goal, ahead of everything else, was putting the Republic back together. His conditions said nothing about droids, nothing about blockades, and nothing about the Clone Wars. It was a demand about what the galaxy would look like on the day after Palpatine was gone. Organa had watched one Senate turn into an empire without a shot fired inside the chamber. He wanted the next one built by people who had agreed on its shape in advance, while they still needed each other. A movement that puts off that agreement until victory puts it off until the moment its members stop needing each other. Organa had already seen what a chamber full of people with different plans could be talked into. Mon Mothma landed between them, and her reason was the most practical. She had backed Padme Amidala's push for peace talks during the war, so Bel Iblis's point carried real weight with her. Her worry was what the Imperial propagandists would do with the news, since they were already selling the Alliance to the galaxy as a conspiracy of radicals and pirates. A Separatist banner flying over a rebel base would have been a gift they could never have made themselves. Sympathy on wavering worlds was the Alliance's only fuel, and she was not willing to burn it. 3 founders, 3 tests, and not one of them was really about hating the old enemy. A man arriving at the Alliance with a Confederacy record could pass one of those and fail another, and 2 men on the Legend side of the record did exactly that. Blox Hatha was a Neimoidian captain from the Trade Federation's own defense fleet, and the Alliance refused him membership. Bel Iblis had drawn his line at war crimes, and Hatha landed on the wrong side of it, so the Confederacy had nothing to do with the refusal. He would have failed Mothma's test as well, since Neimoidians had been the public face of the Trade Federation since the blockade of Naboo, and Imperial propagandists never needed more than a face. Hatha kept fighting anyway. The Alliance handed him a letter of marque, a written license to raid Imperial shipping in the rebellion's name, and he became one of the more effective privateers working the lanes. Refusing his membership was never the same thing as refusing his help. Horn Ambigene walked through a door Hatha could not open, and he paid for it. Ambigene had been a general in the Confederacy's army, and after the surrender, he took his remaining troops into the Bricks sector and kept them in the field as the Bricks Freedom Fighters. Then came the Declaration of Rebellion, the public statement in which the Alliance announced its existence and its aims to the galaxy. Ambigene renounced his separatist past in public, and only then did he bring his soldiers over. Renouncing it in public was no formality. Ambigene had led those men through the surrender and through the years afterward, when holding a sector meant living off what they could take and burying people who could not be replaced. Every one of them had stayed under a Confederacy officer long after the Confederacy stopped existing. He gave up the cause in front of the whole galaxy, and then he asked those same men to follow him into somebody else's army. The Alliance did something with those soldiers next that Ambigene had not been warned about. The Bricks Freedom Fighters did not stay the Bricks Freedom Fighters. Alliance Command took them onto the rolls as the Bricks Sector Force, one more numbered formation inside its own order of battle, taking orders down an Alliance chain. Every fighter walked in, and every rifle walked in with them. The name did not, because a name was the one thing the Alliance could not let a Separatist keep. Losing the name cost Ambigene more than paperwork. A unit carrying its own name can be spoken of as a partner, and a partner can be negotiated with. Alliance planners could send the Brick Sector Force to a system its own people had never heard of. They could hold it out of a fight over its own sector, and Ambigene had no standing left to argue. Imperial forces later ground the Brick Sector down for what he had done, and the name he gave up brought his people nothing. Ambigene was not the only holdout commander who took that deal. A few of the surviving Separatist holdouts came into the Alliance in that same stretch, after 2 events that both fall into BBY. Separatist prisoners held by Ramkota's militia came over in the same years. The first is the Corellian Treaty, signed in Corellia, in which the largest resistance organizations agreed to place themselves under one political and military authority. The second is the Declaration of Rebellion that followed it. From that point forward, the Alliance was one organization rather than a dozen parallel ones, and holdout commanders who wanted in came in on those terms or not at all. Anyone signing those documents set a deadline they could not see. Before the treaty, no single authority existed that could have admitted anybody, and a commander looking for a partner had to guess which cell to approach. Afterward, he had one afternoon to choose. He could hand over the force he had kept for 15 years, or he could stay outside for good. The treaty cured what had been killing the rebellion since its first year. Anti-Imperial resistance began as scattered pieces that had never met. Senators wrote quiet letters, planetary defense forces refused imperial orders, warlords kept private armies, and officers defected one at a time. Each piece had its own idea of what resistance meant. Getting those pieces under one roof nearly ended the movement outright. The first proper meeting of that new leadership happens in a single room on a single world. A scene out of The Force Unleashed. Darth Vader walks into it and takes the entire group prisoner. One room held most of the political leadership the movement had, and one Imperial raid came within minutes of finishing it before it had a name. An organization that has just survived that does not casually invite a second command structure inside itself. Alliance planners feared coming apart more than anything the Empire could do, and that rule bound everybody, not Separatists alone. Four things break the moment the Alliance seats a Separatist government as its partner. Nothing resembling a surviving Confederacy government ever turned up at the door, and Vader had seen to that in the bunker. The rule still decided what happened to the pieces that outlived the Council. Alliance officers lose command of their own war first. They had to strip one sector to prop up another, and empty bases the day holding them stopped making sense, and a partner with its own government kept the right to refuse both orders. Ambogene took orders, and a Confederacy would have taken requests. Underneath command sits the question of who has the right to rule. The Alliance's whole claim was that it carried on a republic Palpatine had stolen, and it could not shake hands with a government whose founding act was walking out of that same republic. Recruiters take the next hit, and everything from the Clone Wars comes back at once. Every Republic veteran the Alliance still needed would have read a Confederacy flag over a Rebel base as the old enemy returned under fresh colors. Clone troopers in Rebel ranks had been grown and trained for one purpose, and the Confederacy was that purpose. Worst of the four is what a deal like that teaches everybody else. Saw would have won at identical terms within the week, and so would every partisan with a grievance and a militia behind him. The Alliance comes apart back into the pieces it was assembled from, except now with signed treaties making the split permanent. Saw Gerrera proves that rule better than any Separatist ever could. Alliance officers found him useful and worked with him when the operation demanded it, and he was never once inside. High Command never brought his partisans into its structure, and by the time of Rogue One, his methods had split him from Alliance leadership entirely. The Gorman Front hardened the same way. Imperial troops turned on a crowd in the Capitol Plaza, and the Gormans who had walked out that morning to stand in a square spent the afternoon carrying their neighbors home. People who have buried a plaza full of their own do not take instructions from a committee 3 sectors away. The rebel network closest to Gorman could not bargain with what that morning created. Saw does eventually agree in Andor to back Anto Krieger's raid on Spellhouse, and he sets his own terms first. He wants equipment, and he wants a free hand over his own troops. Luthen Rael then talks him back out of it, because Imperial security already knows the plan. Krieger's people walk into the trap alone, so that an Imperial source stays buried. Saw's participation had to be bought, negotiated, and then argued away, because nobody could order it. Kalani ends his own story the same way. He fights beside Rex against Imperial troops on Agamar, and then he walks away with his droid army still under his own command. Working together on one job never required either side to fold into the other, and that arrangement stayed open to Separatist remnants for as long as they wanted it. Membership was the one thing nobody got, while keeping a command of their own. Saw had started in a Republic camp on Onderon, learning from Jedi officers how to take a Separatist king apart. He finished as the one-man Alliance command could never absorb, holding his own weapons and his own terms, and answering to nobody above him. The vocabulary changed across 20 years, and the problem underneath it did not. A commander who will not fold his people into somebody else's chain is the same commander whichever flag he arrived under, and the founders had written their rule against the wrong half of him. Separatist people came in at one time, and one Separatist thing came in whole. The rebellion took the Confederacy's ships and flew them under its own colors without a flicker of embarrassment, and the clearest example of it comes out of Legends. One Confederacy warship ended up carrying the Alliance's own fleet command. Rebel 1 had been built for Dooku's navy. A modified Providence-class carrier of the type Separatist admirals flew as a flagship, and its story runs through the comic series Star Wars Rebellion. It came out of the disaster at Deep Space Besh, half-wrecked, and its last mission ended at Banastar Station, where the crew blew it up as Imperials moved to board. Rebel and pirate crews flew Munificent-class frigates as well, the long-nose escorts the banking clan built to screen Dooku's fleets. The same trick turns up in canon, and the Empire fell for it completely. In the novel Tarkin, a rebel cell under a former Imperial officer named Birch Teller hits Imperial installations with a warship rebuilt from Separatist parts, and that ship launches droid fighters. Imperial investigators studied the wreckage and went hunting a Separatist conspiracy that did not exist. Teller's people had chosen that hardware because it worked. The Confederacy left behind more than hulls. It also left a way of fighting, and the rebellion wanted no part of that. Gizor Delso spent the Empire's early years building a second Confederacy on Mustafar. The Geonosian engineer restarted a hidden droid works there and set about rebuilding the army from scratch, and he wanted the Clone Wars started again. The 501st catches his fleet in orbit and burns his factory on the ground. An operation played out mission by mission in Star Wars Battlefront 2 on the Legends side of the record. The whole affair played out less like a battle than like a cleaning job. Imperial forces had done that work dozens of times. An Imperial unit in the Bad Batch removes a former Separatist governor holding the world of Desix with a garrison of battle droids, and the operation carries the flat routine of a familiar afternoon. The reconquest of the Rim ran for years after the surrender, sweeping through Outer Rim systems that had signed with the Confederacy. By the time the Alliance existed to have an opinion about Separatists, Imperial fleets had already finished the biggest holdouts, the ones that held ground and answered to a name. Whatever remained to take in was smaller, quieter, and quicker to move. The largest holdouts died first, and the movement that owned nothing it could not abandon was still fighting at Yavin nearly 20 years later. The Alliance built itself so that nobody could catch it the way Delso was caught. Across Legends, that structure sits in plain view. Much of its fighting strength lived in sector forces, regional formations that could act alone and be rebuilt after they were lost. A central fleet moved between them, and neither the fleet nor the sector forces held ground they had to defend. Ambagene's people entered as one more of those formations. Everything the rebellion kept from the Confederacy went through one final filter. Alliance officers took people, crews, hulls, intelligence, and entire angry populations, and asked nothing about the flag any of it had flown under. One thing never made it through, and Bail Organa had named it years before the first Providence hull flew Rebel colors. In Rebels, Mon Mothma reaches Dantooine aboard the Ghost, the freighter whose crew has just carried her out of an Imperial trap, and she broadcasts to the galaxy from there. Cells answer that call and come together as the Alliance to restore the Republic. Nobody chose those last three words for how they sounded on a recording, and the same aim goes into writing across Legends, through the Corellian Treaty and the Declaration of Rebellion. Organa's membership test reads differently against that broadcast. He was not asking a former Separatist to apologize for the Clone Wars, and he was not screening for Droid Army service records. The name of the movement was its condition of entry, written where every recruit could read it. A committed Separatist who still wanted independence could pass every other test and fail that one alone. The people who believed in the Confederacy had not walked out over a bad chancellor or a bad session of the Senate. They had walked out over the chamber itself, and nothing short of leaving it answered them. In an arc in the Clone Wars, a Separatist delegation presses for recognition of the Confederacy as a government in its own right, not for reforms inside the Republic. Anyone who still held that view would be signing up to rebuild the exact institution he had spent a war escaping. An honest Separatist had every sound reason to join the rebellion. The Empire is a tyranny. It treats his world worse than most, and the Alliance is the largest force in the galaxy shooting at it. For years, both want the same single thing, and they fly the same missions and bury the same friends. Then Andor happens, the Emperor falls, and the question everyone put off for 2 decades walks into the room on its own legs. One side would put the Senate back in its old chamber on Coruscant, and the other side had spent a war and 20 years getting out of that building. Neither has betrayed the other, and a second war was never certain. The disagreement sat in the settlement each side would demand on the morning after. The Alliance was not improvising that promise either. Its founders drafted a civil government alongside the military one, sat down on the Legends side of the record. It set a chain of political authority and carried whole sections straight over from the Republic's own law. Mon Mothma's standing came out of that paperwork. She led the Alliance civil government as its chief of state, and every clause of it assumed a chamber waiting to be filled. Bomo Greenbark could have signed it without difficulty, because he wanted Imperial troops off of his clan's land and nothing more. A Confederacy senator faced something else entirely. Signing meant putting his name to the exact chamber that had ignored his worlds, and he still believed they had been right to walk out of it. Organa's test sorted those two men apart years before either of them reached a recruiting officer. Rebel cells and Separatist believers had already worked out an answer of their own. The two sides usually drifted into something workable, passing each other information and staying out of each other's operations, and nobody signed anything. One sector spent years living out what the founders were afraid of. The Travis sector spent years torn apart by a three-way war, with Imperial forces, pro-Republic resistance groups, and Separatist holdouts all fighting each other at once. Former Separatists and rebels fought each other there while the Empire watched, and none of them had to wait for victory to discover that their arms did not match. Set against that sector, Organa's condition stops looking like a snub aimed at old enemies. It starts looking like a man making sure the war would end on the day it was won. Every faction admitted on its own terms is a faction that has to be satisfied afterward, and opposite settlements cannot all come out of the same piece. Refusing to seat a confederacy inside the alliance kept one specific argument out of the room, and it was the argument that had already burned the galaxy down once. The cost of that landed where such costs always landed. 3 core world senators drew the line, and the worlds that paid for holding it sat out in the rim. Organa kept the argument out of the chamber by keeping its owners out of the chamber, and a Raxan watching from the street would have been right to say so out loud. The rebellion could forgive a Separatist past. Ambogene carried a Confederacy general's record into an Alliance sector force, and quartermasters handed his fighters rifles and ranks without a second look. It could not tolerate a Separatist future, and every soldier who wanted in learned which of those he was giving up. The Empire finished the largest holdouts and kept making smaller enemies it could never finish, and it never understood what it was actually fighting. The reasons it lost the war would have far less to do with Andor than almost anyone believes. So watch this video to find out.